One morning, you are going to open a history textbook, the same one that starts with hunter-gatherers, stone blades, and that slow, painful climb from campfire to plow, and realize the first chapter has been rewritten. Not by science fiction writers, not by conspiracy theorists, and not by people making yellow thumbnail videos, but by archaeologists with brushes and surveying equipment, standing in dusty boots on a plateau in southeastern Turkey. What they have uncovered there in recent years does not just add a few new facts. It breaks the entire logic we have been using to think about the beginning of civilization. A quick overview first. There are two places we need to talk about. The first is Göbekli Tepe. If you have even a passing interest in archaeology, you already know the name. Göbekli Tepe is not just a pile of old stones. It is the oldest known megalithic monument on Earth. Picture massive T-shaped pillars weighing several tons, intricate stone carvings of lions, foxes, and snakes, monumental circular enclosures, and all of it built roughly 12,000 years ago. To understand how shocking that is, remember this. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by thousands of years. The pyramids are only about 4,500 years old. Göbekli Tepe was already ancient long before anyone decided growing wheat was a good idea. The people of that era had no wheel, no metal, and not even pottery. Mammoths were still part of the world, not all that long before them, and yet these people were already creating structures that would still be difficult to build today. The second place is Karahan Tepe, about 25 miles from the first site. For a long time, it was treated like Göbekli's little brother, something similar, but less important. The discoveries of recent years changed that view completely. It turns out we are not looking at isolated structures at all, but at the epicenter of an enormous cultural explosion that swept across the region before the Ice Age had even fully ended. But let us go step by step. Göbekli Tepe. The biggest news of recent years at Göbekli Tepe is not one single spectacular object. It is a change in perspective, and that matters more than any individual artifact. For years, Göbekli Tepe was presented as something completely isolated, a mysterious temple on an empty plateau, built by unknown people for unknown reasons, then deliberately buried and abandoned. It was a romantic story, perfect for ominous music and dramatic narration. But from 2022 through 2024, archaeologists systematically studied not just the central complex, but the entire surrounding landscape, the buffer zone, nearby areas, and the movement routes between the hills. What emerged was this. Göbekli Tepe is not a cathedral in the middle of nowhere. It is the central node of a much larger network of ritual sites, working areas, and, apparently, the routes people followed for decades and centuries. A single monument became an entire system. Excavations from recent years revealed what looks like an industrial zone for its time around the hill, quarries where multi-ton stone blocks were cut, and areas that clearly served as temporary camps for large groups of workers. We are no longer looking at Göbekli as the hallucination of some ancient shaman. We are looking at the result of immense logistics, planning, and social organization. At the same time, restoration was underway. Work on the so-called lion structure, a building decorated with sculpted predators, was completed. Detailed stabilization began in the GT1 sector, and in 2025, special attention focused on one of the major monumental circles with T-shaped pillars. That matters not just on a technical level. When conservators clear walls and document every inch, they also refine the chronology. Which structure came first? How did the layout change? What was rebuilt, and why? Those pillar circles are now at the center of that interpretive work, and in the next few years, this is exactly where we should expect new conclusions about how the entire complex actually functioned. We are starting to understand that these circles did not just sit there abandoned. They were maintained, adjusted, and sometimes radically reworked for new ritual needs. There is another detail from 2025 that is easy to miss because louder headlines drown it out. In that same sector, archaeologists found an anthropomorphic element, a human figure built directly into the architecture of a wall. On the surface, that may sound like just one more find, but its meaning is broader than that. For years, Göbekli Tepe was associated above all with animals, boars, foxes, snakes, birds of prey. Those motifs were everywhere on the pillars and walls. Human imagery seemed to sit somewhere in the background. But this new figure continues a pattern. The people who built this complex placed themselves into the space as something more than a secondary motif. The human image was far more important there than we once assumed. We are finally beginning to see, behind the stones, the people who shaped them. Karahan Tepe. If Göbekli Tepe is the recognized elder, then Karahan Tepe is the bold newcomer, now pulling all the attention toward itself. To understand the scale of the place, imagine a large site literally filled with T-shaped pillars. More than 250 have already been found there, and most are still waiting underground beneath the soil. Serious excavation at Karahan Tepe only began in 2019, but by 2024, it had become the main scientific sensation in Turkey. What makes it different is the extraordinary concentration of human imagery. If Göbekli is dominated by wild nature, Karahan feels more human-centered. This is where archaeologists found the famous chamber with 11 pillars and a human head carved into the rock, attached to a serpent body. It is a space that seems to have been designed from the beginning as a theater for initiation rituals. This place does not merely repeat Göbekli Tepe. It develops its ideas and makes them more complex. Karahan Tepe is not just a temple. It is a place where architecture and bedrock merge into one thing. Buildings there seem to grow directly out of the natural relief, creating a labyrinth that feels unsettling even to a modern visitor. And over the last 2 years, this is where discoveries were made that finally ended some of the older arguments. Now, to the main archaeological news of 2025, not just for this region, but arguably for prehistoric archaeology worldwide. In October 2025, archaeologists at Karahan Tepe found a T-shaped pillar with a carved human face, the first one ever discovered in the history of these excavations. The pillar is about 54 inches tall, sandy in color, and carved from limestone. On its upper portion is a face, deep-set eyes, a broad, straight nose, sharply defined cheekbones. The workmanship is not crude. It is precise, with a pronounced brow ridge and clearly intentional facial proportions. The excavation director, Professor Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, put it simply: there had been one missing element in Karahan Tepe's overall visual system, the face. Now it exists. To understand why that matters, a little context helps. T-shaped pillars are found at Göbekli Tepe, at Karahan Tepe, and at around a dozen other sites in this region. There are thousands of them. Many already show arms, fingers, belts, even clothing. For years, scholars interpreted that as a sign that the pillars represented stylized human figures. But it was still a hypothesis, logical, well-argued, widely accepted, yet lacking direct and unambiguous proof. The face closes that question. These pillars are people, or at least something human-like. They are characters, not just architecture. There is another detail here that news summaries often skip. The pillar was not found in some grand ritual hall. It was found in a domestic space, a small rock-cut house with mud brick walls and a stone floor. Nearby were grinding stones. In that same room stood 2 more small T-shaped pillars, apparently used as roof supports. In other words, this face was looking at people not during some enormous ceremonial moment, but during everyday life, in the space where they ground grain and slept. Professor Karl said this directly. It tells us that the sacred and the domestic were not separated at Karahan Tepe. They existed in the same room. Turkey's culture minister, Mehmet Nuri Ersoy, announcing the discovery, called the pillar the first known example of a Neolithic person depicting themselves on a T-shaped column. That is not journalistic hype. That is the official interpretation after 2 months of studying the find. The face pillar is the loudest discovery, but not the only one. In October of that same year, Professor Karul's team also announced the discovery of more than 30 underground dwellings, carved directly into the bedrock and packed tightly together, almost like honeycomb cells. This matters for scale. Karahan Tepe is not only a ritual complex. People live there, and not randomly, but in a structured, clearly planned environment. If you look at Karahan Tepe as a whole, with its sculpture, its spatial organization, and the blending of domestic and sacred areas, the image it creates is fundamentally different from Göbekli Tepe. In the popular imagination, Göbekli is about nature, about the power of animals, about fear of the predator. Karahan is about the human being. It has a 6.5-foot statue with a carefully worked body. It has a head with a serpent body emerging from the wall. It has a face on a pillar inside a house. If Göbekli is the place where humanity looks outward, then Karahan is the place where humanity looks at itself. Researchers increasingly describe this as spatial direction, the arrangement of figures, the path of movement through a room, the relationships between objects. None of it seems accidental. You enter and see one thing, you turn and see another. Light falls in a certain way. The face on the pillar looks in a particular direction. This is not a loose collection of artifacts. It is a staged experience, something halfway between architecture and performance, except it was created 11,000 years before the word performance even existed. Everything we are talking about belongs to the Taz Tepeler project, a Turkish phrase that simply means stone hills. It is a state-backed program linking about a dozen major Neolithic sites across the region. Göbekli and Karahan are the most famous, but there are others too. Seyburs, Karagedik, Hasan, Keyf, Hoyuk, and more. And the more they are studied, the clearer it becomes that this was not a handful of isolated locations. It was one cultural zone, with a shared symbolic language, shared architectural methods, and most likely connections between communities. That is the main conceptual shift of recent years. Göbekli Tepe is no longer the mysterious exception that somehow breaks all the rules and cannot be explained. It is becoming the most famous example of what may actually have been normal for this region 10 to 12,000 years ago. That changes the question completely. Instead of asking who built this impossible temple, we start asking what kind of culture produced places like this on a regular basis. How was that culture organized? What exactly did people do in these spaces, not just in the vague sense of ritual, but in terms of actual actions, movements, and social interactions? And this is where one of the most uncomfortable conclusions in archaeology enters the picture. The older logic used to be simple: first agriculture, then food surplus, then free time, then temples. Progress is a staircase, step by step. Göbekli Tepe contradicted that logic from the beginning, because it was built by hunter-gatherers, people who were not yet farming grain. Karahan Tepe confirms that. Both sites date to a time when agriculture did not yet exist in the region. The conclusion that more and more researchers now accept goes something like this: agriculture did not create the temples. The temples, or more precisely the need to feed large groups of people gathering to build and maintain ritual centers, may have been one of the engines that pushed humanity toward agriculture. The idea came first. The organization around the idea came first. Wheat was the consequence, not the cause. That is not just an interesting fact. It is a reversal in how we understand what made us human. As of early 2026, Karahan Tepe officially belongs to the group of sites people describe as rewriting history, not in the sensational sense, but in the literal one. Conclusions that once seemed solid now have to be revised. A full research center is taking shape around the site, and that usually means the work is entering a long, intensive phase. In other words, there is going to be a lot more material coming in the next few years. Right now, 2026 feels like a period of interpretation. An enormous amount of data has already been collected: ground scans, genetic analysis, food residue studies, detailed architectural recording. All of that is now being processed, published, and fitted into a larger model. There may not be one single thunderbolt discovery at this exact moment, but there is growing clarity about what the lives of the people who built these places may actually have looked like. And right now, while you are watching this video, someone on the plateau in Şanlıurfa province is probably brushing dust from a stone that has not seen daylight in 11,000 years. That stone may turn out to be another face, or another hand, or something we do not even have a name for yet, because until now, we did not know such things could exist. History is not something that has already been written. It is something that is still being dug out of the ground.